In this lecture, we're going to survey the range and scope of Chaucer's literary work. Chaucer wrote in a variety of forms and genres. As I suggested in my last lecture, he wrote in every available genre at the end of the Middle Ages. Chaucer wrote saints' lives, moral tales, ribald tales, classical stories. We need, in our beginning then, to see the table of contents, as it were, of Chaucer's work. Now, in a modern standard edition of Chaucer's poetry, you have, measured solely by weight, about 4 pounds of literature. How can we assess this in a general way? How can we find our way through the many different kinds of poetry and even prose that Chaucer may have written? Broadly speaking, Chaucer wrote 5 kinds of things. First, he wrote dream poems. Second, he wrote classically inspired poetry of a courtly nature. Third, he wrote what we call frame tale narratives, or collections of stories within stories. Fourth, he wrote short lyrics and personal poems, often addressed to specific individuals. And fifth, he wrote sustained translations from the Latin and the French. Let's look at these 5 kinds of literary production in some detail. The dream poem is one of the most popular forms of poetry in the Middle Ages. In the classic dream poem, a narrator falls asleep and finds himself in a beautiful landscape. Invariably, it's springtime, April or May. The birds are singing, the flowers are in bloom. And the dreamer narrator wanders along byways and paths until he encounters some strange conversation. A conversation between people that he cannot understand, a conversation between animals that he can understand, a conversation between birds, or, in some cases even, a conversation between things. Medieval dream poems are very often also debate poems. They have titles like The Owl and the Nightingale, a poem of the 12th century in which an owl and a nightingale debate their relative merits. Or poems, for example, Wine and Water, Summer and Winter, Christian and Jew, in which these animated or representative figures give voice to their respective virtues and condemn the other's vices. Now, Chaucer begins his poetic career as a dream poet. His Book of the Duchess, as I mentioned in my last lecture, is a dream poem probably written to commemorate the death of John of Gaunt's wife, Blanche the Duchess. And in this poem, the Chaucerian narrator falls asleep and listens to the lament of the Black Knight about the death of his wife. In the course of the poem, we see many allusions to classical and continental literature, we see reflections on philosophy, and we see some quite specific details about medieval courtly life. But there are other dream poems that Chaucer wrote. Another is the Parliament of Foulis, the Parliament of Fowls, or the Parliament of Birds. In this poem, the Chaucerian dreamer narrator imagines himself listening in to a discussion, a debate or argument among different birds. Who shall marry whom? What is the place of bird life in society? One need not go beyond the very title to see the social satire of this poem, the Parliament of Foulis. Is the poem telling us that birds speak in a parliament, or is Chaucer also telling us that something of a human parliament is little more than a babble of bird talk? Now, the third dream poem that Chaucer wrote is the long, complex, enigmatic, and unfinished house of fame. In this poem, Chaucer imagines himself in a dream vision, carried aloft by a long-winded and intellectual eagle, who takes him to the house of fame, the place of poetic fame, where Virgil and the classical poets live. Dante makes an allusive appearance, and just at the end of the poem, or I should more precisely say at the end of the poem as we have it, there is, as Chaucer says, a man of great auctorité, a man of great authority, who will appear, who will explain to Chaucer his poetic and his cultural place in his world. But at this point, the poem breaks off. Did Chaucer leave it unfinished deliberately, or is this a Chaucerian trick, an impossible non-ending for a poem that we ourselves can read with some enjoyment? The fourth dream vision is the legend of good women. Now this is another frame tale experiment, and in this poem, the Chaucerian narrator imagines himself hauled up before the court of love. As I will say in a few minutes, Chaucer is hauled up before the court of love because he's done something in another kind of work. He's translated something, and in particular, he's translated the Romance of the Rose, and he wrote Troilus and Cressade and said bad things about women. And so the court of love calls him to account and asks him to write a poem about good women rather than bad women. And so there is a set of tales that follows this imagined forensic encounter, which are stories of idealized good women who've been wronged by men. The scope of Chaucer's dream poetry, I am suggesting, goes beyond the formal paradigms of the medieval genre. It's not just a debate between opposing points of view or opposing visions of the world. Rather, it's the debate, publicly and privately, that Chaucer and his audience would have experienced in their own lives. The second kind of poetry that Chaucer wrote is what I'm calling classically inspired poetry of a courtly nature. Now, medieval courtiers and kings and aristocrats liked nothing better than to imagine themselves as figures from a classical past. And the classical past that they saw themselves most pointedly involved in was the world of Troy, the world of Athens, the world of ancient Greece. In fact, at the close of the 14th century, London was known as Troy Novant, New Troy. So Chaucer sets one of his major poems in the world of Troy, Troilus and Cressade, a story of love and politics and of betrayal. But there are many other poems set in a classical world that would have appealed to this historical fantasy of late medieval aristocratic life. The Knight's Tale, the first of the Canterbury Tales, a great long story of two men in love with the same woman. This Knight's Tale tells a story of Theseus and his classical world. It's full of gods, it's full of allusions to great writers of Latin antiquity, it's full of high, what Chaucer would have called sentence, sententiousness, or moral virtue. But there are also many other short and fragmentary poems, little poems like Annalita and Arcite, for example, which you may see as something like a five-finger exercise for the Knight's Tale. Stories set in a classical world that would have appealed to a contemporary aristocratic fascination with antiquity. The third kind of literature that Chaucer wrote, and the one to which he devoted most of his time, apparently, is the frame tale narrative. Now, I mentioned in my previous lecture that Chaucer may have learned of this form or may have modeled something of his works on the Decameron of Boccaccio. And the idea, the notion of the frame tale narrative is to encompass the range of stories within an overarching frame or overarching setting. Now, in Boccaccio, it's a story of people escaping from the plague and telling tales along the way to pass the time. In the Canterbury Tales, it's the story of individuals on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas à Becket in Canterbury, in Kent. And as they move along the roadway from London to Canterbury, each pilgrim, each representative of a social class, of a profession, of an ecclesiastical calling, of a personal type, of a gendered identity, tells a story. Chaucer envisioned, apparently, a vast compendium of Canterbury stories. His host, at the beginning of the story, Harry Bailey, argues that everyone should tell a tale to pass the time, and that each person, in fact, should tell 2 tales on the way to Canterbury and 2 tales on the way back. Now, there are 28 pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. There's the host, Harry Bailey, and there's Chaucer the narrator. That's 30 potential tale tellers. 30 times 4 is 120. 120 tales would outdo even Boccaccio, what presented 100 tales in the Decameron. But Chaucer either didn't live to complete the project or abandoned it midway. There are no tales coming back. It's, for all intents and purposes, a one-way journey. Certain figures tell no tales at all. And in fact, the only figure of the Canterbury Tales to tell 2 stories is the Chaucerian narrator himself. The host calls upon Chaucer, as we will see later in this course, to tell a story. And he tells a tale that is so bad, that is so unlistenable, that Harry Bailey has to interrupt it. The drasty reaming is not worth a turd. You're drasty, you're drafty, rotten. A beautiful Chaucerian coinage, by the way. Drasty, kind of drafty, but kind of, I think the best way to translate drasty is crappy. Your crappy rhyming, Harry Bailey says, isn't worth a turd. Now, let me just say to you, as a professor of literature, I dread the Harry Baileys of this world. I dread the possibility of a reader or a critic who will tell me that my drasty rhyming isn't worth a turd. And so, Chaucer, the narrator, decides to tell another kind of story, the tale of Melibea. Instead of a rhymed tale that he fails at, Chaucer responds by telling a long prose allegory. The point of all this being, Chaucer's the only character in the Canterbury Tales, the frame tale narrative, who actually gets, either by design or by default, to tell 2 stories. The Legend of Good Women, however, is another frame tale fiction. And as I mentioned here, the pretense is not a journey, but an inquest, in which Chaucer is asked to tell a range of stories to acquit himself of the sin of being mean to women. Now, the 4th kind of writing that Chaucer did, and he clearly did a lot of it, was the kind of writing that he calls ballads, or what we would call short lyrics. These short lyrics are very often addressed to individuals in Chaucer's political or social circle. We're going to look at one in detail in a later lecture, which we know as Truth. These are popular moral ballads for the later Middle Ages. They're some of the most popular and interesting of Chaucer's poetry for his later readers. They show us, as it were, an unadulterated, or perhaps an unironic, or an undiluted Chaucer. Chaucer, the political figure, writing to people of his time. We're also, in a later lecture, going to look at another example of Chaucer the lyricist, Chaucer's words to his scribe Adam. A single stanza brutally condemning his scribe for mangling his verses. So Chaucer is a lyric poet, he's a frame tale poet, he's a classical poet, he's a dream poet, and finally, Chaucer is a translator. Chaucer produced several translations. For example, his major sustained piece of translation is the translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. This is a long work in Latin prose and verse which describes Boethius a figure who died in the year 524, who's just about to be executed. Boethius laments his state, and Lady Philosophy, a visionary figure, comes to him to educate him. The Consolation of Philosophy is a dialogue about desire, it's a dialogue about worldly goods, and it's a dialogue about putting aside fortune for faith. Chaucer translated it whole. He translated it into English prose. And as we will see in subsequent lectures, it became a cornerstone of the philosophical edifice on which he built his work. Chaucer also translated, at least in fragments, the old French Romance of the Rose. Written in the 13th century by two men, begun by Guillaume de Loris and completed by Jeanne de Meun, the Romance of the Rose is an erotic dream vision in which the dreamer imagines a quest for the beautiful rose, the rosebud, which is his love. And his love and his desire is to pluck that rose. Now, medieval readers, like modern readers, knew exactly what the allegory was in this poem. And the Romance of the Rose is one of the most controversial of poems in the Middle Ages, not just for its blunt eroticism, but for its condemnation of women. The Romance of the Rose, if any of you should care to read it, is, I guarantee you, the most obscene poem you will ever read. And in the prologue to The Legend of Good Women, the god of love condemns Chaucer, and I read it to you. "Thou mayst it not deny," says the god to Chaucer. "You may not deny it. For in plain text, without the need of glows, thou hast translated the Romance of the Rose." In plain text, I'm not going to gloss over it, you have translated the Romance of the Rose. That is an heresy against my law. That is a heresy against my law. The translation of the Romance of the Rose may have condemned Chaucer in certain circles, but it elevated him in others. Chaucer's French contemporary, Eustace Duchamp, called Chaucer le grand translateur, the great translator, most likely because of this translation. But I want you to understand, too, that not only did Chaucer translate specific works, like Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy or the Romance of the Rose, but rather one should think of all of Chaucer's works as translations of a certain kind. In the Middle Ages, the Latin word translatio, which we translate as translation, literally meant a carrying over. And it could be a linguistic carrying over or a cultural carrying over. Translatio means bringing something from one place to another. We still use that term in its medieval sense when we talk in the church about the translation of the bones of a saint, meaning the moving physically of the bones of a saint from one place to another. Translation is the medieval mode. You took stories from elsewhere. You borrowed characters. Chaucer himself, who had traveled to Europe, who read widely in classical and in continental literatures, cobbles together a corpus of literature from different works and different texts. Translation is therefore the Chaucerian mode as well, because it enables us to see how Chaucer carries over from the past or from a European present different works and different texts. This is not to say that Chaucer is a plagiarist or that Chaucer is unoriginal. Rather, it is to say that in the Middle Ages, the conception of originality and the conception of authorship is a different one from our own. How can we gain some access into that conception? At the close of the Canterbury Tales, after the parson has concluded the tales with his long prose sermon, Chaucer apparently offers up a retraction. Now, the idea of retracting your works is probably as old as literature itself. And one of the best models is the work of St. Augustine, who in the 5th century had produced a retraction. That is, a list of everything he wrote, and then a comment as to whether he thought it was good or bad. This constitutes for us a canon, a table of contents. And in a lecture devoted to the overview of Chaucer's works, what better way to see Chaucer's canon than to look a little at the retraction? I'm going to read to you a little bit of the retraction, just so you can see how Chaucer himself frames his own sense of his work. The retraction is headed in the medieval manuscripts, "Here talketh the mocker of this book his lave." Here the maker of this book takes his leave. "Nu pray ye to him Allah, that herkna this little treatise, or rede, that if there be anything in it that liketh him, that thereof they thanken, or Lord Jesu Christ, of whom proceedeth all wit and all goodness." Now I pray to them, Chaucer says, who might listen to this book or read it, that if there's anything that's pleasing to them, that they thank our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom all intelligence and all goodness comes. "And if," he goes on, "there be anything that displays him, I pray him also that they ret it to the default of mean uncunning, and not to may will, that would full fain have said better if he had had cunning." He says, now if there's anything in here you don't like, just blame it to the fact that I'm stupid, because my intent is not to deceive or to displease you, and if I were smarter, I would have written something better. And so he says, "Forgive me guiltis." Forgive me my sins. Now this, by the way, is, I believe, the Middle English version of the Pater Noster. Guiltis is the way in which the Middle English translation of the Lord's Prayer would have given sins. Forgive me my sins. Chaucer's confession. Namely, my translations, my translations, my enditings, my inditings or poetic versions of worldly vanities, the which I revoke in me retractions, which I revoke in my retractions. And this is what he revokes: the book of Troilus, the book of Fama, the book of the 25 Laddies, the book of the Duchess, the book of the Parliament of Foolis, the Talus of Canterbury, Thilke that's sown into sin, the book of the Tales of Canterbury, especially those that are conducive to sin, the book of the Leon, the book of the Lion, a lost book, and many another book, if they were in me remembrance, and many other books, if I could remember them, and many a song, and many a lecherous lay. These are all the things he wants to be forgiven for. But the things he wants to be remembered for, he says, the Translatio of Boes, de Consolation, the translation of Boethius, and he says, other books of legends of saints and homilies and morality and devotion. Other books and legends of saints and moralities and devotions. Now, one of the things I want you to think about as you read and think about Chaucer is, how straight can we take this retraction? Is this a deathbed revocation of sinful works by a man fearful for his soul? Or is this an ironic statement, a play, as it were, as playful as any of Chaucer's other works? What is the status of the retraction? I'll be coming back to it again and again, because we need to understand here how Chaucer is perhaps never dropping the persona of the playful, literate, and literary narrator. Let's use the template of the retraction to review the scope of Chaucer's work. Let's say first that he is a writer of the spirit and the flesh. He does have religious poetry. The Parson's Tale and the Tale of Melody are, in the Canterbury Tales, two long prose treatises about morality and sin. He wrote a little poem called the ABC, a prayer that is as devotional and as devout and as spiritual as any of the doctrinal works of the Middle Ages. If he is a poet of the spirit and the flesh, He is also a poet of intellect and desire. Chaucer is intimately familiar with the philosophical debates of his time. He comments on the scholar's pursuit, on the nature of love, on the intellectual climate of a world at the end of the 14th century that's seeing the establishment of universities and schools. The Clerk's Tale, a story by a learned man borrowed from Petrarch about patience. The Wife of Bath's Tale, a long, garrulous autobiographical discourse by a woman more learned and more literate than she might appear. And of course, Troilus and Cressade, a poem whose erotically driven figures can only barely consummate their love because, seemingly at every turning, they are breaking into philosophical lament or lyric outburst. Chaucer, too, is a writer of elevation and obscenity. A great critic of Chaucer has said that Chaucer is never so spiritual as when he is obscene. The translation of the Romance of the Rose, for all of its ribaldry, cannot hold a candle to the screams, the farts, the misdirected kisses, and the body parts of the Miller's Tale. It cannot hold a candle to the obscenity of the Friars and the Sumner's Tales, the last of which hinges on a pun on farthing, which is a farthing, the smallest coin, and farting. How can one divide a farting into 12 parts? If you want the answer to that, read the Sumner's Tale. The Pardoner's Tale, the tale told by a man, as Chaucer says, who may be a gelding, a eunuch, or a mara, a homosexual. A moral sermon that the pardoner himself gets swept away with as he turns to Chaucer's host Harry Bailey and asks him for money to buy a pardon and indulgence to save his soul. And Harry Bailey, remember, the critic who would call Chaucer's own bad poetry not worth a turd, Harry Bailey turns in anger to this pardoner, and he says, "I would I had the cullions in my hand. I wish I had your balls in my hand." This is as rude as it gets. But it is not simply rudeness for the sake of rudeness. It is Chaucer showing us that human language can scrape the bottom and aspire to the stars. And at moments when things break down in anger and obscenity, I suggest that Chaucer is showing us how human language itself breaks down, how we lose the reference for our words, and how anger can take over where intellect should prevail. Broadly speaking, then, Chaucer is, in his own words, a poet of what he calls earnest and gamma. Earnest is seriousness. Gamma is play. At the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, the host, Harry Bailey, says that whoever tells the best story will be treated to a supper at everybody else's cost when they return. And Harry Bailey's idea of the best story is a tale of sentence and solace, of moral virtue and of entertainment. Just before the Miller's Tale, when Chaucer is about to give us the story, the fablio, the domestic sex farce, told by the drunken miller, Chaucer says, "Aviseth you and put me out of blama." Don't blame me for what you are about to hear. "And eke men shall not maken earnest of gamma, and men shall not make earnest out of game." In reading Chaucer, our challenge is not just to take game where we find earnest, but to make that earnest out of Chaucer's game and see the philosophical and intellectual inheritance that shapes his entire work. Thank you.